Good evening. We are actually going to look back and look ahead in this conversation, but before we do that, I think we should look back. And it would only behove this moment as we turn 3 that we all applaud the efforts of Dhruva Jaishankar, Sharon, and their team for putting together a wonderful institution in 3 years' time that is already making its presence felt around the world. And truly, if in 2018, when Dhruva and I went for a walk in Stockholm and spoke about the possibility of building something like this here, if at that time someone had told me that this is where you will be in 3 years' time in 2023, I wouldn't have believed that person. But Dhruva has done it, so please join me in applauding Dhruva, Sharon, and the team for this. They also make better videos than ORF India, by the way. Terrible. We've been trying to get that right. So with this wonderful panel, I thought what we could really do is go around the panel once and ask you a bit about what's been happening in the previous year. Maybe we could start with Carl. You're closest to me, Carl, in terms of both our relationship as well as the proximity. I thought we should start with you and ask you what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Ukraine. Jane asked, how is the Ukraine conflict going to end? What is the off-ramp? What are the likelihoods of any solutions there in the year 2024? Or what does 2023 tell us about 2024?
Good question, to which I don't have a good answer. But will peace come? There was a question put to, it was quite interesting in the sort of the last few days, I think it was 4 or 5 days ago, that President Putin had his annual huge press conference. He skipped it last year, but he gave one this year. 2 things were interesting. First, there was opinion polls done, sort of reasonably reliable, in Russia. Prior to that one, it's a huge public event. And they asked, what kind of question would you like to ask the president? And the number 1 was, when will peace come? He was asked that question. And he said, yep, peace will come when I have achieved all objectives. And then he added, and they haven't been changed since I launched the war. It doesn't use the term war, but anyhow, since I launched it. And he said it is complete security and political control of Ukraine, effectively. So Putin is fairly sort of determined that he can only win this war, and it's true, as a matter of fact. I don't think losing the war is an option for Putin, because he knows that losing the war means losing power. And negotiations, compromise, whatever, is not on his agenda. That doesn't mean that there aren't others in Russia who would be interested in closing down this completely insane war from the Russian point of view. But he does control the country. He did have a fairly tense moment in the summer, if you remember. But at the moment, he seems to have consolidated power, and he's fairly confident that he can stay with the war until there might be change in this particular country. I think that is the only hope.
So let me ask you on that. Now, as a European,
as someone... I'm a European, correct.
Yeah, I mean, we can't change that. But
no one is perfect.
As a European, what worries you? The possible change in government, fatigue factor, or even, you see the little bit of mischief the countries within your continent are playing as well?
But you see, this war is going to go on for quite some time, I fear. It's going to go on until, or to backtrack, peace. Peace is a rather ambitious word. Peace will not come until we have rather fundamental change in the Kremlin, Putin gone. I think with Putin gone, things will change fairly rapidly in Russia. And it will not change...
Isn't that a maximalist position?
It's a maximalist, well, you might argue it's a maximalist position, but Putin has put out a maximalist position himself. If Putin had said, I'm ready for a compromise of some sort, then a compromise of some sort would have emerged at some point in time, after very much pain and difficulties. But he has put out a maximalist position.
Well, okay,
and that maximalist position is unachievable.
Let me challenge you on that.
Yeah,
there would be a large constituency, especially in the different continents. I mean, we were in South Africa recently, and we had countries from that part of the world. They would argue that you've not given that compromise option to Putin to choose from.
But I'm not aware of South Africa playing a major
No,
role
not South
in this
Africa.
war.
I was in South Africa, and there were many countries there.
I'm not aware of many countries playing any role in the battlefield. The war is fought by the Ukrainians defending their country. And I can assure you that the Ukrainians are going to continue to defend their country as long as they can.
Okay.
They might be, you might argue, they might be conquered by the Russians at some point in time. I think that's unlikely, but it's a possibility, in which case the consequences will be horrific, also for European security and I think also for global stability. But there's a lot of compromise, there's a lot of speculation in this town as well. You could do that sort of compromise and Trump or whatever. It's not going to change that much because it's the Ukrainians that are fighting the war.
Prime Minister Harper, can I come to you with the same question?
Yeah, and I would give more or less the same answer. I don't think there's any near-term prospect for peace for exactly on the Russian side for exactly the reasons that Carl said. Vladimir Putin cannot afford to look like he's failed to achieve his objectives because he's a dead man walking in the near term, if that's true. But on the Ukrainian side, I think you have to remember that, you know, after Minsk and after all of their history, they can't afford to agree to any kind of peace or ceasefire that would cause them to drop their guard because it would almost be certain they'd face renewed attacks. So, look, I think the best we can hope for is that you know, fighting essentially becomes a stalemate along the line. A current line, by the way, which isn't that far off Ukraine's natural division between Ukrainian and Russian speakers. But look, longer term, I think that the issue that really has to be addressed from the United States and the Western side is why this happened. In my judgment, this happened for the same reason we have a war in Gaza and the same reason we have a threat of a war in Guyana, the failure of the United States and the West to provide adequate deterrence. And that failure has been all about not putting Ukraine in NATO. If Ukraine had been put in NATO when George W. Bush and myself and others tried to do this in 2008, this war never would have happened. So we've kind of, at some point, got to correct that error.
And what about the US elections? And does it really change what could happen in 2024?
I'm not sure. Obviously, if the current president's reelected, you can expect the same policy. A lot of speculation about what a reelected Trump would do. My own guess is that, kind of contrary to expectations, that he'd go off in some wild direction. I think in the near term he'd be likely to support a very similar position to what we have now. Mm-hmm. He's not saying that as a candidate, but my guess is immediately there wouldn't be a big change. But look, we don't know, as Jane said, we don't know what the outcome of the election would be, and more importantly, trying to predict, in particular, Donald Trump is a risky business.
Hazardous. Senator Payne, the same question to you, but let me add a little bit of twist to it. What does this conflict that continues to persist do to the equations in the Asia-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific? What does it do to the Chinese maneuvers in that region? How does it implicate our part of the world, as it were?
Well, I'm taking James' advice and I'm buckling in for the foreseeable future as I watch US politics. But I also think her observation about the most populous nations of the world going to elections in 2024, whether it is the United States or India or Indonesia, Russia, and a number of others, is a seriously confronting test for the democratic process, more democratic in some places than others, obviously. I think the challenges that we are continuing to look at in the Indo-Pacific, and Australia sits comfortably at the bottom of the globe and looks up and across for our perspective, are deeply serious. Nobody should underestimate the seriousness of the engagements between China and the Philippines. over the Scarborough Shoals and other Philippine land within their EEZ and their continental shelf. You should never underestimate when forces, whether naval or coast guard or maritime support, willingly damage other vessels with water cannon and with ramming. Our defence forces, yours, mine, everybody else's in this room, go out of their way to train to avoid miscalculation, error, and so on. But when these are intentional acts, this is a very, very different situation. So these are deeply serious, and the Philippines are working very hard, I think, including under the chapeau of the 2016 UNCLOS arbitral decision in their favour, to assert with transparency and with openness, using all of the technology available to us in the 21st century, to show what is being done to them for what are basic resupply missions to personnel who are posted in these areas. They are resupply missions. They are not missions that are endeavouring to take areas. They are not missions which are trying to violate any international law or similar. So that is deeply serious. They've received the support of Australia, of Canada, of the United States, of Japan. Japan has just, in the last Japan-ASEAN meeting, supported the Philippines, Indonesia, with a new patrol boat, Malaysia with similar material and drones, which help them with maritime security. So the partners and the allies of the region take these issues very, very seriously. Then we see similar engagements between Japanese and Chinese coast guards around the Senkaku, which are again contested as well. So this is continuing, and I think one of the real challenges that we have globally, both within governments and within organisations like our think tanks, so many of which are represented here tonight, is when you are watching two wars, when you are watching Ukraine and Russia, when you are watching what is happening in Gaza, it is so easy for the bandwidth to do other things to just disappear. But we cannot afford to take our eyes off that game, of that particular aspect of international strategic competition, which is very real. And our friends in ASEAN, and I think there are probably potentially a number of countries of ASEAN represented here tonight, our friends in ASEAN need the support of their partners and their allies when they do stand up for themselves, when they do try to bring transparency to that sort of intimidation and that sort of coercion. It's deeply serious and deeply dangerous.
In your response, US was missing. And I want to ask you about the US specifically. You mentioned the capacity, the bandwidth. Do you think with the elections coming in, with them already being engaged in Ukraine, a big contest, trying to manage the situation in the Middle East, is this one of the most vulnerable times in that part of the world?
Well, it has the potential to be. I don't think it is at this point. And the US was not missing purposefully. In fact, by implication, I was saying that the US's eyes are very firmly focused on Ukraine, on Gaza as well. But also, as I said, they've expressed strong support for what the Philippines is doing and is dealing with. Strong and vocal support, which is very welcome, including not an exercise of, but at least an invocation of the US-Philippines military agreement, which underpins that aspect of the relationship. But for me, what it means is that partners and allies of the United States, and no matter which category we fall in, have an opportunity and, in my view, an obligation to step up at a point where there are a lot of demands and a lot of tensions being placed on our good friend and ally, the United States. We have an obligation to go one step further, to reach further, to engage further, to make the views of, in this case, Western partners and allies very clear.
David, would you want to come in on this? I know you focus on the more benign world of energy politics, but I think you are also part of the university system, which is quite political.
Can I just say what a sign of normalcy that you describe the world of energy politics as benign? I think it's extraordinary that we have two significant wars underway in Gaza and Ukraine. We have these skirmishes that are very dangerous. Right now, we're not, it's not the most existential dangers, but they could really get out of control given everything that's going on. We had a whole bunch of people show up in Dubai. We had a gigantic conference about climate change. It was more or less a success. You had a communique at the end where diplomats did what diplomats do, which is they find ways to get people to agree even when they don't agree. It's a little bit like having an Indian wedding and then having a communique at the end of the Indian wedding.
Listen, after the end of the Indian wedding, we have lots of babies. We have 1.4 billion people. So we have outcomes. Like the Indian G20, we have outcomes. Ambitious and long.
So we had a communique, we agreed. The headlines were not related to what was actually agreed. But much more importantly, we have all of these side events that are going on related to decarbonization of the energy system, not fast enough to stop warming at 1.5 degrees. Whoever believes we're going to stop warming at 1.5 degrees is smoking and inhaling some amazing product. And I'd like, as a Californian, I feel left out of that party. But we're beginning to make progress. The world was on track for 4 or 5 degrees centigrade or Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels maybe 15, 20 years ago. Now we're on track for 2.5 degrees. And it's because of a new theory of change where new companies are developing things, testing things. Some of them are working, some of them are failing. We saw the Dubai Climate Conference. We saw not just renewables, but nuclear in a way that I've never seen before at a climate conference, including from the younger generation. Extraordinary stuff on nuclear power. Across the board, methane, big agreement on methane, more or less telling people to do what the industry's known how to do for a while. So I think it's actually pretty extraordinary that we have all of these geopolitical tensions and we can still walk and chew gum at the same time and work on these longer term problems.
The dean of Lee Kuan Yew School actually said that climate change could be the inadvertent cooperation arena, where in a polarized world, you could actually build coalitions. It might be difficult to cooperate in many other spaces, but climate could be one space. And I'm going to come back to our European to talk about nuclear power soon. I'm just going to come back, so hold that thought. But let me turn to Gaza. We've heard Gaza a few times. Let me turn to Ibtisam, and let's go to the Middle East. Big issue in your part of the world, but here as well. Just a few months ago, we were talking about connectivity corridors, normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran, Israel and others, and the Mediterranean to the Arabian Sea, and big announcements. They were ambitious, and these were genuine. There were leaders from each of these countries who had committed to move in that direction. What went wrong? Or has it gone wrong? Is it just an aberration? Are we going to pick up the pieces and move ahead? Or do you think there's something significant that has happened here, which is going to be a break from that trend we were seeing towards normalization of some sorts at the time?
Look, Samir, there are things we call them, or give them expression, strategic shocks. Trump was of, was of them. The pandemic, Ukraine, and Gaza war, which changed the scene. You are right. And that period we can see before Gaza war, all the regional players, they were in fatigue of confrontation, wars, name them Iran, Turkey, Saudi, my country, the Qataris. So they came to the fact that none of them can achieve or their goals is feasible. So why not to come to a win-win situation? Manifested in the Abrahamic Accord, in the rapprochement between UAE, Iran, Saudi, Iran. And I believe that the Abrahamic Accord also, at least from UAE perspective, which believe that it cannot work in a world of conflict, that this is the best way, okay, to bring peace. And at that time, Palestinian issues wasn't neglected, but thinking out of the box, how to approach peace, and at the same time, and we all remember that the condition put for the Netanyahu for freezing the settlement, okay? He did not do that, but we continue with that. And we were a believer in and we still believe in that. It's not about only normalization. It's about tolerance between religions. And I think at that time, many in the Arab world, although many condemnation we got, believed in that. This 70 years of war between Arab and the Israeli did not achieve anything. Every war, the Palestinian and the Arab losing more lands rather than gaining more. Gaza war was also strategic shock, is a game changer, as Abrahamic Accord was a game changer. But you have to know why this happened, Samir. It's not because something wrong with the Abrahamic Accord. It was because some of losers in the region, they tend to be spoilers. Hamas was a loser because the Saudi went to talk in their normalization or talking to Israel. They ignored Hamas and they went only talk to Palestinian Authority. The Iranian also thought they are loser because of this, and not only because of this, because of the Indian Middle East Europe corridor, because they've been also excluded. The Russian also was losers because they have been sanctioned, isolated, okay? The Chinese also thought they are losers because that Indian Middle East Europe corridor, that was deliberate, done, this is what they thought, by USA to move from Bilton Road to another road. So all these losers became spoiler. And I think everybody knows that.
Looking ahead, look, the bilateral, it's going, but you have to know, this did not happen only from Gaza war, because of the Netanyahu's government, and I said that in Herzliya, that if this government will continue, nobody will join the club. Nobody will join the club. Now, it is exacerbating with the situation in the war of Gaza. The Arab street become more nationalist and become more Islamist. By the way, even the liberals, many of those liberals, I see them in the social media, okay, looking to Hamas as a hero, Palestinian themselves. So it's not easy to convince again the Arab street without reaching, without stopping the war. Now, who has interest to stop the war? Hamas has no interest. Netanyahu has no interest. And continue the war, it is prevent the Abrahamic Accord and what's coming from An-Naqab summit and all of those dreams not to fulfill its goals.
Prime Minister, you have spent a lot of time in the region recently. You've been traveling and touring for and meeting with leaders in that particular part of the world. What is your take on what's happening? Is there, again, in 2024, light at the end of the tunnel?
Probably not in 2024. I'm somewhat more optimistic. I have a different take. I think what's really critical in the war now, and I'd say my view may be very different than many here, is that Israel actually achieve its objective, which is the eradication of Hamas. If Israel doesn't achieve its objective, then in effect the war isn't over, and it will reignite at some point. If Israel, we had a game changer with the Abraham Accords, we had a game changer with this war, but if Hamas is eradicated, that is also a game changer. And then the question really becomes, how is Gaza going to be governed? And I think the real question there, you know, in the short term, I think it's really clear what's going to happen, regardless of what the U.S. administration wants. The Israelis are going to take responsibility for security in the absence of anyone else. Then I think the real question will be, will the more progressive Arab nations help to govern Gaza? Because if they don't, the alternative is either Israel or Iran, and Israel is not going to permit Iran to have proxies governing Gaza ever again. So I think that's what's really critical. I think if you get that resolved, I think the reasons for the Abraham Accords, the reconciliation of a big part of the Sunni Arab world and Israel, there are very deep motivations for this that are economic, that are cultural, that are security, especially around Iran. Those things haven't gone away. And so I do think in the midterm, there's a chance that process can resume. But in the end, the Gaza war must end, and the only way it ends is with the eradication of Hamas.
Sorry, Carl, you want to come in?
Well, Hamas is, of course, a function of something that is there. That's the problem. So getting rid of Hamas is, I mean, we're all in favor of it, but it's easier said than done. If you look at opinion polls at the moment, Hamas is more popular among the Palestinians than have ever been. Because they are seen as having achieved something that no one else could have achieved. I mean, that's the brutal reality of it. And I would say that for all of the complexities of Gaza, and one of the questions, I mean, there are mind-bogglingly difficult questions what to do with this place of 2 million people. I would say the most important and most explosive place is the West Bank in Jerusalem. We were both in Israel in the spring, and I had been there a couple of months before. I hadn't been there for 10 years. And I was horrified by the trends that I saw. It was obvious at that time that an explosion was coming. I didn't think it was going to come in Gaza. I was quite convinced it was going to come in West Bank. And I think I might still be correct on that one, because the situation is not going to work. And that is why, if I have an effort at being optimistic in this particular situation, it might be that the shock of what has happened is so profound that it causes a rethink on all sides. On all sides. So to move to some sort of political two-state settlement. And I've seen sort of very clear statements coming out of this capital, much clearer than we've seen for a very long time. That's good. Then critical is the United States able and willing to go the way in action that his words are. In that case, yep, we might have something achieving that is good out of this bad. If that doesn't happen, I fear that we will see a repetition of this particular war.
David, we heard early in the evening from Jane that she was told by Scowcroft that foreign policy was not the reason why the government lost. Is foreign policy going to be a factor in the elections in 2024? This particular conflict, you see mobilizations across campuses, you see Democrats coalesce was the word Sanjay used, coalesce around the grievance of inaction or US action, whichever way you want to frame it. Do you think it's a factor?
Yeah, I think Jane's larger point was spot on, which is this is a narrowly fought election. And so therefore everything matters. And you see crazy things. You see younger generation upset about the US position in support of Israel and therefore withdrawing support for the Biden administration. It's just unbelievable. And they may not show up at the polls. And we saw in the last election, turnout really matters. Turnout will really matter in this case. So it's hard to predict. I think we all have kind of put on the seatbelt sign on the airplane and said, get ready for a rough landing. It's going to be a very interesting period the next 11 months. My guess is the election is mostly going to be won on sentiment. Sentiment is being formed, voter sentiment is being formed right now for what's relevant next fall. We have this incredible disconnect between the data, which show the economy is actually doing amazingly well. Wage levels are up, a bunch of other things. It's not perfect. And then you see this kind of malaise, and it's not just an inflation malaise, it's a malaise. There's this lovely piece that Fareed Zakaria has in the current issue of Foreign Affairs that's about how do you, what's gone wrong in America where you are able to win an election by talking down your country. And that's what Trump did successfully last time around. He may well do successfully this time around.
Prime Minister Harper, I can't resist but ask you, so pardon me. How's Canada doing? Look, don't get me wrong.
You.
Serious
I
question.
was going to say,
mean, you know,
I wasn't
look,
sure how
you've been more.
how
was
you
that a
were going to
joke
phrase
line?
this question.
I mean, look, I didn't know how to phrase this question, but millions are talking about your country. You must be happy, right?
I've tried to be diplomatic about this. We've talked, and I've heard you talk, Samir, about parts of the world, India certainly, that's so central to ORF, the Gulf, and maybe a few others seeking what you call strategic autonomy.
Correct.
I would describe the current Canadian foreign policy as seeking non-strategic autonomy. That is, seemingly fights with everyone for no apparent reason. So look, we'll just leave that aside. Look, the reality in Canada is this, and look, I'm not a supporter of the government. I think everyone knows that, so my views won't be a big surprise. But I think, objectively speaking, first of all, I might dispute with David about how well the American economy is actually doing. It's clearly not doing well in Canada. In fact, the real income, the per capita income of Canadians is actually declining in the last couple of years. And there are very few prospects of growth. For that reason alone, the government is 20 points behind in the polls and will be defeated in 2 years. So that's kind of the prospects for Canada, and I don't think, you know, there's always, of course, a chance that a government's in trouble, seeks a bunch of new policies to turn things around, but I think we're likely looking at 2 long years and then a change of government, and then we'll see what happens.
I also wanted to ask the panel, and I'm going to bring some of you in. I think I've already alerted some of you, or my colleagues would have reached out to you. I want to bring a few of you into this conversation, but before I do that, I just want to ask all of you. 50% of the world is going to be electing their leaders in the coming 12 to 24 months. It's the first time in the digital age that this is happening. It's never happened before, right? US and India have elections in the same year only once in 20 years, and we didn't have X or Twitter 20 years ago. So this is the first time it's happening in a highly mediated ecosystem. Fake news, propaganda, misinformation, interference, outside actors, name it. Everything is going to happen. Deep fakes, synthetic truth, name it. The challenge is none of these. The challenge is the demographics in our own countries. We saw young people, you said young people are actually going to allow Trump to win because they don't agree with Biden policy on Israel. I think that's what I understood from what you said, David. What's happening with the young generation? Have we lost them? Do we get them? Do leaders understand them?
Good question. If we look at the sort of the last few years of European elections, and we have elections all the time. I mean, if we are in the EU, 27 countries that have election every day, more or less. But the last European elections, the last elections that I can remember, we had a higher turnout of younger people than we had before. So they're clearly not sort of leaving the political process, but they're engaged in the political process.
It's the choices I'm talking about. Their
Sorry?
choices.
Their choices is going in different directions. I don't think there's any sort of firm pattern. I mean, what you see in European politics is, of course, that you have much that you have in this country. There's a fear of migration that is playing a very substantial role. Affects primarily the elder part of the generation. We also have the inflation effect that we mentioned, living standards going down. I mean, that's all over the place because prices are higher and wages have not been following up. So that affects it. I don't think there's a particular trend that I can see among young voters in Europe going in either one or the other direction. They have been more supportive of a more integrative approach on migrants to some extent, more an integrated approach on European integration to some extent.
Netherlands notwithstanding.
Sorry? Yeah, Netherlands with extent. Yeah, absolutely. The Dutch election was a surprise to the Dutch as well. And it might have been a couple of temporary factors. Dutch politics is notoriously volatile. Notoriously volatile. And they'd had, just the last year before the election, they had first one party that was set up from nowhere with the Farmers' Protest Party. that suddenly was the number one in the opinion polls. Then it had another party that suddenly was coming, where the breakaway from the CDA party, a guy who is somewhat a dissident, but not entirely sort of madman. He was number one in the opinion polls. And then suddenly on election day, you had Geert Wilders the number one. So he's notoriously volatile. And I think that volatility will continue in Dutch politics. Then they will have to form a
But
coalition.
that's not the state of European politics generally. It's more Dutch.
Well, it's very Dutch.
Okay.
But it has to be said, European politics is becoming more volatile. But the Dutch are at the end of that particular scale in terms of volatility. They have always been.
Prime Minister Harper?
So look, let me just answer your question a little more generally. First of all, I wouldn't generalize about the next generation. I've been around long enough to not only know that there are a whole bunch of different views in this generation, but that generations have a way of changing over time. You know, the generation of the 60s elected Ronald Reagan president, 15 years later. So, people's views change and evolve. And this sort of takes me back to a really fundamental reason I remain optimistic is that so much of the world is in fact democratic. Democracies get a lot wrong at any given point of time, but democracies evolve, they learn, they course correct. There's been a lot of ink spilled, maybe not in the last few years, but when I was PM, about how wonderful the autocrats were in the decisions they make, especially China. The Chinese could get everything right 50 years ahead of time. Well, guess what? When autocratic systems make bad judgments, as China did on COVID or as Putin did on Ukraine, they saddle their countries with disasters that go on for years, if not decades. So I think that the fact that we have engaged young people and they will continue to be engaged will probably help us arrive at better solutions over time. I think the challenge for democracies is really the question, Henry Kissinger talked a lot about this. Can we sustain healthy democracies without deliberative processes? And modern means of communication, social media with its disinformation, misinformation, kind of instant gratification, doesn't do a lot to encourage deliberative decision making. But as I say, I'm still optimistic that over time that free flow of information leads people to better decisions rather than worse ones.
Okay, I'm now going to turn to you. So can I request the mic to move to Satu? Go ahead, Satu.
Yeah, well, thanks for a terrific panel.
A quick introduction so that...
my name is Satu Limbe. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center and a fellow at the Center for Naval Analysis. Appreciate the panel. I was thinking here, we have three distinguished and experienced politicians also on the panel. I was thinking if this discussion were held at a Kiwanis Club or a Rotary meeting, luncheon in Michigan or North Carolina or one of the swing states, because one of our speakers said that American elections are likely to scare the world. But the world also somewhat creates anxiety and maybe indifference in the United States on and off. What would be your message to American electorate in 2024 about why the resolution or the handling of issues like Gaza, Ukraine, global economic order, global South matters to them?
So I'll come back to you. Just we'll take the questions and then we'll come back. And I'll remind you in case any one of you forgets what the question was. Let me turn to Anjali Kaur, the mic to Anjali. Thank you, Anjali.
Hi, Anjali Kaur, USAID. I think I'd love to understand the notion of freedom of speech in this evolution of a democratic state that we live in, and how the freedom of speech gets impeded on whether we refer to a war and whether we start limiting based on hate speech or the notion of expression. And you can refer to what's happening with universities in the United States or across the world, what we're seeing happen. Thanks.
James, can I come to you?
Well, I want to thank you for letting me ask a question, because I think this question is really important to all of us. I think the most transformational impact that India is going to have in world affairs in the next years is in Africa. And here's why. This is the African nations have the fastest growing explosive population growth that is going to impact all of us. None of us have the capacity or the interests to move the needle. And the only way I think that we are going to successfully partner with the forces for good in Africa is if the United States and our European partners and our friends in the Middle East and our friends in the Indo-Pacific, particularly India, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, work together in some kind of collected effort to partner constructively. And I think this is the greatest challenge, the single greatest challenge that we have. And I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on that.
Okay, so I have two more folks I'm going to turn to, but let's take these three questions first. The message to America from the panel. If you are addressing folks in American heartland, what would your message be? Ukraine, Middle East, economic order, international role for America, why are they important for America?
Well, a stable world is, of course, something that is good also for the prosperity and well-being of the average American, wherever that particular American happens to be. And a world where we have wars is a bad one. And the US has a powerful role in stabilizing different parts of the world. If you would let, I can't say that the United States can do it, but I mean, if Putin were to win in Ukraine, no question that would embolden China, no question that that would make the challenges in the Pacific much more complicated, no question that that will complicate the issues also bringing stability to the United States. So they all link together. Stephen said that's an absence of leadership, or whatever you said. There is that link between the different conflicts that is related to the way in which America is prepared to exercise its powers, and you might also say its responsibilities.
Senator Payne?
I was told for years not to give free advice to other countries as a diplomatic representative of my own country, so I've spent a lot of time avoiding that. And in fact, I wouldn't. I don't think it's for me to say anything to the United States about their own democratic processes. I did actually want to pick up on the question about freedom of speech, though, if I may, because I think in a period of heightened tensions and tensions which are playing out domestically in many countries, and it's happening in my own as well, that how politicians, practicing politicians, and I'm a recovering, recently retired practicing politician, how politicians deal with the questions of social cohesion and social harmony at times of heightened tension in a completely different communications environment than the one in which most of them began their processes. I sat in the Australian Senate for 26 and a half years. Until the advent of Twitter transforming itself into X. Before that, you actually had to make a case. You had to develop an argument. You had to be able to present that, articulate that, campaign for that in a small c sense, run that through a media process, maybe even end up doing press conferences, give a speech, etc. Now it's a 100+ character statement that can make or break your career or someone else's. TikTok, everything that goes with every platform that we can identify is changing the way that practicing politicians have to operate, and it's changing the way we perceive freedom of speech as well, and it deeply concerns me. My personal view about social media is that it completely removes the need for the exercise of common basic respect. Completely removes that need. And what happens is that people forget that they're not using a keyboard, and they exercise that complete lack of respect in all of their engagements. And it makes the political environment particularly toxic, and it makes many other environments toxic. On university campuses in Australia, this is an issue currently, and not just related to October 7 and events that have flowed from that. It has been an increasing issue in Australia for some time. So how we deal with that, I think, is a challenge for this decade and the next, because it can only get worse and it can only grow in impact and influence. AI, and which was not one of the issues that was in Samir's list, AI goes a whole step further in complicating how we know what we are dealing with. And frankly, your basic garden variety politician, the overwhelming majority of them do not rise to leadership or ministerial roles. That's just the fundamental operation of numbers. Fundamentally, they're not trained to deal in that and with that. And as democracies, nascent or long-standing, we need to think about how we enable our parliamentary and elected representatives at so many levels to do better at what they do, and that has a pivotal impact on in fact, in my view, on the engagement of young people in appreciating the value of the democratic process and appreciating the rights that they have to exercise freedom of speech or a vote.
Prime Minister.
Sorry, just on both. First, I'll be quick on the freedom of speech. I've always been reluctant to, talk about speech codes and these sorts of things. But when you've got protesters outside Scotiabank headquarters in Toronto chanting "Gas the Jews," which is what they chant, I think you're kind of beyond what we would consider any rational political advocacy. You're into the advocacy of violence against people. So I do think at some point you got to draw the line. How you do it through social media, big questions I don't have an easy answer to. I am going to answer the question, though, on what message I have for Americans. As a Canadian, I always used to say, like you, I'm not going to tell foreigners how to think, but with Americans, we Canadians always think they're not really foreigners. They're just our neighbors and brothers here, or cousins. So I'll tell you what I think, and I think it's really important. I know that we always forget America's had such an important leadership role in the world. We often forget that America never sought this leadership role. This leadership role really came about because of a series of events that led to World War II and America's involvement in World War II. And America's made lots of mistakes, but we've had under American leadership in the world for the first time a dominant world power that was rules-oriented, not conquest-oriented, and it's made a huge difference to the world. And a lot of us have been very sanguine over the past couple of decades about decline of American power, multipolarity, etc. But I just think there's just growing evidence that a world without strong American leadership is not going to be an alternative rules-based order. It is going to be a law of the jungle. It's going to be all about power politics at all times. And so I just think it is so essential for the world that America assert leadership, no matter how frustrating that leadership is as an experience, no matter how often it isn't followed. I think it's important that America do that for the world, but also for America's own interest. If Putin conquers Ukraine, the entire security of the European continent is altered. If Israel were ever to fall to jihadists, the entire Middle East is altered. And God help us if we had a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And to think Americans cannot believe that these things would not have a real serious impact on the United States if they were to happen. So I just think the U.S., as much as it hates world leadership, must exercise it.
Yeah, and maybe I'll offer advice to...
I'll just come to David and then I'll come to this. Go ahead.
Maybe I'll offer advice to incumbents, not just Americans. I mean, when the voters think that the world is on fire and they've got this pipe of information that's not really deliberation that comes out of social media, I think it's not surprising that they're upset with institutions, and for the most part, respect for institutions is very low. And so I think incumbents everywhere are in trouble. So we're going to see a lot of elections, and we're going to see a lot of incumbents lose. I assume we're going to see a swing to the right for the most part. And I think they have to articulate what Stephen said here, which is what's the role of, why is it important to have rules-based order? What are the tangible benefits from that? I'm an unabashed internationalist. Maybe that's why I'm in a university and not running for political office. But I think we've got to really articulate that. And that relates to the answer on campuses. I'm on a university campus. It has been a bad few weeks for college presidents. It's never good when your leaders of important academic institutions are being parodied with success on Saturday Night Live. When you're helping Saturday Night Live be funny, it's not good. It's just not, Saturday Night Live, for the most part, needs to get funnier. I think they have failed to articulate why we exist in universities. And part of this is speech. We are so obsessed around the abstract notion of freedom of speech and not enough attentive to content and responsibility for content.
Ebtisam, sorry.
Well, in the Middle East, they think American create problem when they step in, and they create more problem when they step out. Okay? I would say, you know, we have different America. I mean, it's becoming, since Obama, I would say, there is a gap between the American and the Middle Eastern. Okay? And United States has to know the region. I mean, miscalculation create a lot of problem in the region. This has happened with Obama, happened with Trump, happened also with Biden. What happened in Afghanistan, nobody forgot. Okay, this has also made the images very dark. That about what kind of values the Americans are holding. The double standards also. This is one of how the Middle Eastern, I'm talking about, when I'm talking about Middle East, is the Arab countries, okay? And they are thinking the Americans are biased for Gulfists when it comes to Iran, and still it's biased. And a lot of mistake has been done and not ratified, okay? If United States think that the region is not important, it is very important. What's happening in the region, bringing always a United States aid. So if there is a new administration coming, who knows, need to understand the region from the people in the region. I meet many people that are saying, I'm a specialist in the Gulf. How long have you spent in the Gulf? I stay there 1 month. Come on. Even the Gulf, there's difference between the Saudi, the Emirati, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis. They're different. So you need more consultation with the people in the region to more understand the region, to take the right decisions.
My name is Mariam Wardak. I run an organization called Her Afghanistan, and I also dabble in media. It's really interesting that all the topics that we've discussed from United States all across the world, I just wanted to know the perspective you hold on Afghanistan's current situation.
So that's the final intervention in Afghanistan. Your assessment of what's happening in Afghanistan, why have you forgotten about Afghanistan? I think that's a fair question to ask. We move to the next crisis. Nothing has been done about the previous one. And there's a question that was asked by James, Africa. And is it time to get our act together, work together as a coalition from the Indo-Pacific to Europe to put together something which is worthwhile for that continent? So you can start, you can pick one of these two questions and I'll just go on.
I could also pick both. And to say, I think it's a shame that we have forgotten Afghanistan. I mean, it sort of disappeared from everywhere and the country is still there. And it's a fairly tragic situation. There are things that have improved in terms of security of the country, but the human rights situation, the social development situation, appalling. We have, from the Swedish or European side, we still have, from the European Union is present in Afghanistan with a fairly large development program. We try to continue the aid programs that we used to have, but it's not easy. But we are not giving up entirely, but it's extremely difficult. On Africa, agree completely. If you look at the European Commission that we have now, which is coming to the end next year, when it came into power so nearly 5 years ago, the first thing they did was all of them took the first flight to Addis Ababa to meet the African Union, saying this is the priority for European foreign affairs in the next 5 years, to develop a better relationship and to help and partnership or whatever with Africa. Now we have been, to put it mildly, somewhat distracted since then with other events, but the priority with Africa, I think, is, from the European point of view, but also from other points of view, absolutely essential.
Ebtisam, let's turn to you. Africa Partnership, Middle East, again UAE and others are focused on the continent. And is there a chance to partner with Europe, America, India and others to create an Africa proposition?
Yeah, of course. You know, I think the Gulfists, they revisit their alliances, their ideas that the world should be multipolar than bipolar or polar. That's why they are seeking partnership with India, with Africa. Africa and Asia matter for them more now because of the economic connectivity, okay? The United States matter for them as alliance, as provider of arms. But as I said, maybe for UAE, if I'm saying more, lost credibility when we have been attacked by Houthi, and the American did not take a quick reaction to that. That's why also you are looking. And now USA, either or. Come on, this is a multipolar world. You cannot say either or. My national interest comes above that. Then I choose. My partnership with India may be worth more than my partnership with US or others or other. So Africa, problem with Africa now, everybody competing there. The European, the Russian, the American, the others are there. And how you can bring stability to this country? You see the wars in Mali and others, and sometimes the French, sometimes the Turks, sometimes. How can you stable this with different and this conflict of interest?
Understood.
I would reiterate some of the things said. When I said there needs to be a reassertion of American and broader Western leadership, I'm not referring just to security. I do think we've also kind of lost the focus on development leadership as well. And I think that's the coordination and the development and the really getting into that business back into that business in a very meaningful way with a very different model than the Chinese and Russians and others are offering is something very important that needs to be done.
And Afghanistan?
Well, look, all I can say about Afghanistan is I just, like as you know, I'm a philosophical conservative, and I continue to be just very, very frustrated by the number of decisions I see being made in the world that are just not based on kind of firm international policy reality. I remember at the time Afghanistan was falling through the unprovoked surrender of the Biden administration. The word out there, well, it wasn't going to be so bad because this was a new Taliban and they'd learned. Like who could realistically think the Taliban would be different the second time than they were the first time? And I say, I just keep hoping that somehow we will banish these kinds of notions in our thinking and bring a lot more hard-headedness to international affairs, because the Afghanistan thing is a disaster.
I think the challenge from my perspective and where Australia sits in the world, particularly in relation to Africa, is that we can't shift the dial unless it's in a partnership, unless it's in a structured relationship or coalition. We have continuing diplomatic presence from the top to the bottom, obviously, but it's less than it was. And if we're going to engage, then it has to be, I think, in strong partnerships. And there's not a lack of willingness, but there is a lack of a plan. It would be fair to say. I think to take Stephen's point about where the world is sitting in terms of development leadership at the moment. My personal view is that a lot of the focus of development leadership has been sucked into the climate stream, if you like. So those who were very focused on development have diverted a lot of their attention onto climate. That is not a criticism, it's just an observation. And so the development lane is less crowded and the climate lane is phenomenally crowded. And somebody was saying the number of NGOs who were at COP numbered in the thousands this time. A lot of those NGOs would previously have been in the development lane. And we need to be conscious of that and decide how to, I think, have a better balance between the two sides. On Afghanistan, I would have to say there is not a week in my professional life where I don't think about the situation, particularly of women and girls in Afghanistan. In fact, there's probably not a day. It's been something that I have been passionate about and have worked on for as long as I can recall. And we don't have a solution, don't even have a glimmer of hope, in my view. And that is devastating to me and devastating to those many people who gave their lives, including Australians, in the cause of that fight for so many years. I absolutely agree with Stephen. Expecting a new Taliban is like expecting a different Hamas. It is completely nonsensical. These are not groups or people or philosophies or approaches which change. And if we do that, we are condemning ourselves to recommit the mistakes of the past.
I think these remarks on Afghanistan are correct. I can't defend the tactics of what the Biden administration did and the way they left. I do think Afghanistan is one of the many places where, absent a clear articulation of strategy, there's fatigue in the American public and many publics for actions overseas. But I want to close on this issue of the Africa question, if you like, and suggest that insofar as we start worrying about climate, we should probably think less in the classic foreign policy geography terms. What should we do about Africa? There's a whole class of countries, societies, parts of countries that are less developed, with less capable institutions, that are less able to mobilize capital and do things like look ahead and look at what are the physical effects of climate change. What are they going to be? We are making progress on the climate problem overall, but we are in for a lot of climate change. And that will disproportionately hit the most vulnerable countries. And many of them are in Africa, some of them are in India's neighborhood, some of them are in Latin America, and Pacific Islands in particular. And so we need a strategy there. And I think it's actually, I'm going to make a sharper point than you were implying. I think it's actually a huge loss that we have so many NGOs that were development focused, and have now gone on to climate, but have not understood the fundamental problem in climate, which is not actually the emissions from those countries, it's the resilience. And so resilience is the key here, and that will be the big stumbling block politically for future climate talks. They dodged a bullet this year with this loss and damage fund, which doesn't really exist. I mean, it exists, but doesn't have any money, doesn't have a strategy. Other than that, it exists. That will be the core political problem on the climate problem.
Resilience. I think that's a good word to conclude this conversation on. I think resilience is something that we require not just to confront climate change, which is already upon us, but also the political changes that will be soon upon us, and the geopolitical changes that continue to surprise us in the months past and in the weeks ahead. But I think we've had a serious conversation on some serious matters. It's not necessarily been very uplifting. I think it was slightly like a Tarantino film. There was no light at the end of any tunnel that we tried to explore. But we can conclude with three bad newses. One, we are going for elections next year, and hence we are not going to pay attention to the bad newses. That's one bad news, that we are all going to be so obsessed with our own elections and fighting our own political battles that I don't think there is going to be too much bandwidth available in political leadership to really focus on some of these most consequential events, developments, changes that are currently underway. And that's bad. Second bad news, that it means lots of work for think tanks. We'll have to do a lot of research, a lot of writing, lots of developments that will have to be studied, analyzed, put out. And the third bad news, the political leaders will have to read them. So, I think that's a good way to end this dinner this evening. Please enjoy the rest of it, and please join me in applauding this wonderful panel. And of course, well done, ORF America, and many, many more years to you.